Hello, I'm Shashank Joshi, defense editor at The Economist, and I'm very pleased to have Megha and Alison both here with me today. A very warm welcome to you both. Thank you so much for joining us. Perhaps you could just give us a brief word of introduction each. Megha.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm Megha Rajagopalan. I'm a correspondent with Buzzfeed News based in London, and I was based in China from 2012 to 2018 as a journalist.
And Alison.
Again, thanks for having us here. I'm Alison Killing. I'm an architect by background. I now mostly work on investigations. And for the past 2 or 3 years, I've been working together with Megha and Buzzfeed News on the network of camps in Xinjiang.
Thank you both, and welcome again. You've just told us a little bit about your investigation into those camps, and we'll return to that in just a minute. But I think we can't let it pass without noting that you won a Pulitzer-Prize for your story. So very many congratulations for that. And why don't you start by telling us, what did it feel like to win a prize for this? Did it feel like there was a spotlight being shone on these investigative methods that you were applying? And what impact has the story had since you broke it?
I'll just start by saying, of course, we're extremely grateful, and I was so surprised that to win the Pulitzer, particularly because there was so much amazing coverage last year of the impact of the coronavirus crisis. But I guess we don't do the work to win awards, but I think we're particularly grateful because it has brought so much more attention to this issue, which of course we both feel is one of the most pressing human rights concerns in the whole world. It's an issue that historically hasn't really gotten enough coverage or enough attention. So I'm hopeful that the award will bring it a little bit more.
I want to talk a little bit about the skills and the techniques involved. But before we get on to the technology, so to speak, and the raw material of your investigation, I just thought it would be interesting to talk a little bit about your backgrounds. Alison, you mentioned in your opening remarks that you're a licensed architect. I'm fascinated with the thought of how did that inform your investigation? Can you just tell us a little bit about what it allowed you to see, what it allowed you to do with this story?
Sure. I mean, there's a number of ways in which it was really helpful to have those sorts of skills to bring to this investigation. So, one of the things is that as an architect, you're very good at flipping between looking at 3D objects and two-dimensional representations of that. So interpreting satellite imagery was something that comes quite naturally. And similarly, then taking ground level imagery of the same places and sort of matching that to satellite imagery has been really useful in helping us to identify and corroborate that some of these places are camps. And then, there's like kind of general architecture and urban planning knowledge that helped us to narrow down where to look, that we knew that they had to be building these camps probably close to existing towns, close to infrastructure, and that helped us to narrow down our search. And, also just knowledge about how buildings are built and structural grids and things like that helped us to use the satellite imagery that we had and interpret that, and then bring that together with detainee interviews to reconstruct one of the buildings from one of the camps and sort of give a real sense of what life was like inside there.
And it's a real understanding even of things like building materials, isn't it? I mean, I was struck by one of the lines in your piece, which noted that these newer compounds built by the Chinese were built to last because you pointed out they had thick, solid concrete walls rather than barbed wire, indicating that this was something that was really meant to stick around for a long time. So, it goes right down to the materials, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's also something that we can see again in the satellite imagery, that the early makeshift camps were put together very, very quickly, like in a matter of weeks or actually even days. You can put together, you can sort of put up barbed wire fences very, very quickly in a compound. You can put together industrial sheds also very, very quickly and convert former schools and housing estates into camps. But then with these new facilities, concrete takes, they had to dig foundations. That takes a certain amount of time. They had to pour concrete. It takes 28 days to cure and be ready. And so knowing that also sort of helped us to interpret what was happening.
Um, Megha, you're not an architect, but you're a very experienced correspondent. You spent 6 years reporting from China. Can you just tell us a little bit about how difficult a target it is as a place to report on, not just China, but specifically Xinjiang? How did you deal with sources? Were they worried about talking to you? Did they fear retribution? Did you have any access on the ground? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So lots of journalists have traveled on the ground in Xinjiang, including myself. It's gotten definitely when I moved to China in 2012, it was a little bit easier to access than it is now. Since this has become a global news story, the access has gotten, progressively sort of worse. When I was in country and traveling in the region, one of the biggest issues was that journalists would get detained while traveling, which is basically an effort by police to halt the course of your work. And another thing was that sources would be routinely harassed. So if you were trying to speak to somebody normal, just an average person about what they were experiencing, they would have this fear in the back of their mind that, this would be discovered through some form of surveillance. And whether it's a police officer following a journalist or like cell phone surveillance or what have you. And that would make them really reluctant to talk to you. And then on my side, it presents a real ethical quandary for how you can interview people without doing harm to them. So that was one of the problems we faced in the story. I had lost my China visa by the time we started this project, and Alison and Krista were also not in a position to visit the country, based in part on the sensitivity of the work. So we had to find ways to sort of work around that problem. All of the interviews we did with former detainees for this series were done outside of China, and the majority of them were done in Kazakhstan, where a lot of people had left the camps and then gone on to resettle because they had Kazakh ethnicity and a connection to the country, either through citizenship or through a close family member. That presents its own challenges. It meant that some of the information we got wasn't the most immediate. It also meant that this problem of people facing retaliation from the Chinese government, it still hadn't completely gone away, because almost everyone we interviewed still has family back in the PRC, and the Chinese government has repeatedly gone after people's families for choosing to speak out about this issue. I've been struck because when I first started covering this, it was really, really difficult to get people to talk about it. Even people who weren't immediately connected to the camps themselves were still really reluctant to talk to journalists, even if they were living abroad, because of this problem of, this fear that people have that their families will face blowback. But as the situation progressed into, 2018, 2019, 2020, people started being a lot more friendly to journalists, because I think a lot of people sort of made this calculus that if they didn't speak up, if the kind of the small percentage of the population from Xinjiang that has actually successfully left the country despite the restrictions on passports and so forth, if that group of people didn't speak up publicly, then it might be that nobody would, and that the world would not actually come to know of any of these atrocities. So I think we were helped in large part by people that did make that decision and saw a kind of like a social need or social good in being interviewed for the project, and we're really grateful for that.
And so, I mean, you've just outlined a lot of obstacles to traditional on-the-ground reporting, from government repression, to the inaccessibility of the place. That naturally, I think, says something about the appeal of satellite imagery, which is, remotely accessible, can penetrate into places where the local government, doesn't want it to. How did you get onto that? What made you think of turning to satellite imagery? Were you inspired by any other reporting cases, any other stories? Did either of you have experience of using imagery for your work prior to this?
It's like using satellite imagery is the sort of thing that I would do quite often as an architect when you're starting to research a site. It's just to sort of get a sense of what the place is like, what the surroundings are like. So I had some experience already. I think that, so Megha was the first journalist to actually visit one of the camps, and that was sort of back in sort of summer of 2017, I think. And the way that she'd done it was to go and do some interviews with with former detainees in Kazakhstan, one of whom had been able to show her in Google Maps where the camp that they'd stayed at was. And from there, she was able to go and visit it. So there was already like some work that had been done. And then the two of us met at we met for the first time at a workshop in summer 2018, and got talking and realized that we had complementary skills to be able to work on this sort of topic, and that satellite imagery might be a really good way to try and investigate a subject where there were difficulties of access and also challenges of scale, because like Xinjiang is like, it's something like 4 times bigger than Alaska. And yeah, we've already discussed some of the access issues. But there's also, challenges of information control. And here was a source of information that the Chinese government wasn't able to control. And for that reason, it seemed that satellite imagery would be a really good way to start trying to investigate this issue.
So I think one of the fascinating things about your story is that it isn't just about the fact that satellites can see things, but of course that's fundamental to it. But it's equally about the fact that what you try and hide can reveal quite a lot, as you outlined a little bit in your outline of the story just before our conversation here. If you had to sit through all of the satellite images for Xinjiang, you've pointed out its size, that would be prohibitive. But in a way, there's a kind of Satellitestreisand effect, isn't there, where the more a government tries to hide things, the more it can point to them or highlight them. And your story sort of relied on that, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, our story relied on the fact that there was censorship within Baidu, which was something that I discovered sort of late in 2018 as I was looking for something else. And I realized that as you zoomed in on locations where we knew there were camps, that suddenly this white square would appear over the location and then would quickly disappear. And we realized that this was happening in a number of places, that we could also reproduce this phenomenon. And that made us realize that we had a technique that we could probably use to try and find the rest of the camps, that we could like go and look at, make note of those locations and go and look at them in uncensored satellite imagery and see what was there. And yeah, that absolutely did help us to narrow down where to look. It's quite ironic, that in trying to hide this stuff, the Chinese government actually drew attention to the thing that they were trying to hide and showed us where it was. But even then, we found that, although it did help us, we still found that we were looking at about 5 million locations. And it turned out that a lot of things were censored, and that it covered pretty much anything of strategic value, from military bases to power plants to industrial sites to prisons and detention camps. And so to narrow that down further, we started to focus on areas around towns and along major infrastructure. And then that gave us about 50,000 locations to sort through. And from there, we started to work through them systematically. I did around 10,000 in a week, which covered all of Kashgar prefecture. And like having done that we had a really strong idea both of the range of sort of compounds that tended to be used for camps and what they looked like, and also the range of locations that we tended to find them in. So they were very often on industrial estates, just on the outskirts of towns. There were quite a few sort of former schools and hospitals which had been converted, but you would often see these bright blue industrial sheds either squashed between buildings or on playing fields. And then there were also a number of much larger, much higher security, purpose-built facilities, which looked, very definitely like prisons because of like these really thick walls around them, like 1.5 to 2 meters thick, and the guard towers and layers of barbed wire around them, which were reasonably easy to identify definitively.
And I think what's so interesting is that the process that you're describing of narrowing your search, but still having lots to slug through, hour by hour, pouring through imagery, but looking for signatures of something, knowing roughly what you're looking for, it sort of characterizes a lot of the open source research that we see today, kind of both in terms of the investigative journalism that you've been doing in the fields that I cover. I've seen it recently in the cases of researchers discovering Chinese missile silos using many of the same processes and same means, hunting for telltale signatures of some feature across large numbers of images. And it's interesting kind of how similar that is. But, Megha, it's what I get also from the story is that it's very much about triangulation of lots of different kinds of data. It isn't just human interviewees and pictures from the earth. In the broad effort to document these sites, work by yourself, by the Australian think tank ASPI, and so many others, you're drawing on things like public procurement notices from China. You're drawing from Chinese social media feeds. And the question that raises for me is, how much of this do you think would have been possible 10, 15, 20 years ago? Is this sort of investigation becoming possible thanks to new types of data, new ways of cataloging it that just didn't exist a decade ago? I mean, is this novel, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think public access to satellite images, like high quality satellite images, has created this avenue of investigation for journalists. We would not obviously have been able to use this technique before then. I think an important piece of context here is we've talked a little bit about the problems with physical access in Xinjiang, but when you're talking about China, there's also a problem of digital access, and that's because China has basically the most sophisticated national censorship system in the world, which means that a lot of the kind of documents that journalists would have traditionally relied on, and could still in other parts of the world, just aren't available. So, for instance, our series is about prisons and extrajudicial internment camps. In other countries, you would be able to use freedom of information laws to request data and documentation about facilities like this. You would be able to go and interview police officers and request police data. You would have a lot more information on contracts and contractors with the government. These are all different country to country, but China is among the most opaque places, at least that I have ever worked. So that sort of creates this challenge where you have this really sprawling program that's created by the government, and there are very, very few ways to investigate it. You can sort of talk to people and gather witness accounts in the way that journalists have traditionally done, but that is just sort of a piece of that story. Using satellite images sort of enabled us to sort of buttress those accounts, and the accounts then also helped us understand the images. And we pieced that together with other bits of data that were already out there, like, as you said, like procurement notices that were found by us and other researchers, information about companies that create surveillance systems for these camps. All of those things helped us put together a more complete picture of what this entire program looks like, and sort of more importantly, how it's actually experienced by people on the ground, and what the architecture of the camps tells us about that experience that detainees have.
Alison, one thing I think is very interesting is that you're not just able to task high resolution satellites to take images on demand for particular things that you want, but you also can dive back into this repository of historical imagery. You have sort of high cadence coverage of the same place over a long period of time. How useful was that to your efforts?
Yeah, so the historical imagery and just like that density of imagery across Xinjiang has been really, really helpful. I mean, one thing, just like a really basic thing, is that on some days you'll have better atmospheric conditions than others. Some days the satellite imagery will be taken from a slightly different angle, and so you'll have like better clarity of image. You'll have be able to see distinct features more easily. Sometimes you'll get a side-on view of a building, so you can actually see how tall it is, all of which is really, really helpful. But having that historical imagery was also more helpful in terms of being able to show the way that the camp system had progressed, we would be able to see when specific camps had been built and to see the progress of this program. We were also able to see things like, so as I said before, there were a lot of makeshift camps, converted schools and hospitals, which had barbed wire fencing in the courtyards. And that was like a really key characteristic of those early camps. And in sort of late 2019, a lot of that was taken away while we believe that they continued to function as camps. And if we had only had like the most recent imagery, we never would have been able to go back and check and say like, oh wait, were those telltale signs of this being a camp present in sort of mid 2018, and to verify in that way. So yeah, it's really helpful to have that historical imagery for a number of reasons. We've been very lucky to have that density of historical imagery where we've been able to have images, high resolution images, perhaps like every few weeks or at least every few months over the past few years.
You talked about the buildings changing, barbed wire being removed. I mean, one interesting question is, you look back at the advent of satellite reconnaissance at the beginning of the Cold War, and it was a sort of revolutionary change. States realized what this could do. They also adapted. They learned that they had to start hiding aircraft programs or missile programs from the air. They had to undertake deceptive practices. They had to learn, if you want to test a new weapon, you have to do it when your adversary doesn't have a satellite on orbit. But you were only protecting yourself from other states and other state rivals. You weren't having to protect yourself against journalists who could access commercial satellite imagery. Now that states ultimately have to face scrutiny of the sort that you've provided, do you see any sign that they're adapting to this, that they're undertaking deceptive architectural changes, making camps look like something else, or trying to conceal things from the air? Do you think that they might start doing that now that they've realized how much they've exposed via these means from commercial imagery?
So I don't think that they would worry about that so much. I don't think that we're going to see sort of physical measures to try and cover up buildings or airfields or whatever. What I think we're much more likely to see is legal means to restrict access to satellite imagery.
You share that view?
Yeah, more or less, I totally agree with all of that. I guess I haven't seen this phenomenon in Xinjiang, or at least I haven't noticed yet. But I used to cover North Korea when I was based in China. So it was a lot about Chinese trade with North Korea. And we always used to ask this question because there would be like this cycle where the Chinese government would say like, okay, we're cutting off trade of certain goods to North Korea in order to comply with UN sanctions. And then everybody would immediately, like all of the experts would immediately hop on and look at satellite images to see if, like what ships were transiting between the two ports in the two countries, and whether there were trucks filled with goods going through the bridge to North Korea, and what sort of trucks there were and stuff like that. And it was always this kind of conscious thing that these analysts are writing publicly, and the government knows that this is like one of the first indicators that people look for in this on this incredibly opaque subject. And so how is it possible that there's not some reaction? And I guess like there's a lot of theories about it, but of course, like one of the things that we've seen happen over and over again is that China will sort of claim to pull back from trade with North Korea, and yet a lot of it goes through still illicitly. So it goes to show you that I think the least that we can say is that for sure the people that are making decisions about facts on the ground are well aware that researchers use satellite images in this way. That's been true for a long time, in the sense that militaries and intelligence apparatuses around the world have used satellite images to glean this type of information. But now you have this additional layer of public scrutiny and scrutiny from journalists that can lead to public embarrassment from a lot of these countries. So it sort of begs the question of whether the reaction will be different.
I think one interesting question in asking whether Western governments will also try and resurrect some of the legal constraints that operated in the earlier days of satellite imagery is how much does it affect them? Is this kind of scrutiny really a challenge principally to the North Koreas and Chinas of this world? Or Megha, do you also see examples of it being used to good effect against open societies and Western governments?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure Alison will have a lot to say about this as well, but I think like there are so many different uses for investigations using satellite imagery. It doesn't all have to be about like human rights and mass atrocities. Like there's like some of the best kind of journalistic applications lie in monitoring and investigating environmental degradation, impacts of oil spills, forest fires, like all of these kinds of things, the movement of migration and growth of places like refugee camps, all of these kinds of subjects, like it doesn't matter whether it's an authoritarian country or democratic society or whatever, like, there are places all over the world that have these issues. There are lots of societies that we would consider open that aren't actually that transparent at all, where it's really, really hard to access certain places for journalists or to get information from authoritative sources. I think in those scenarios, satellite imagery can be helpful in the same way that it was helpful to us in investigating, a place in China.
Megha, can I zoom out and just think about some of the implications of your work and this kind of work more generally? What impact did it have politically, do you think, if any? And I guess what I'm trying to ask is, does open source investigation make a difference? Does exposure make a difference? Because, of course, China still claims that its detention camps are something else entirely benign, in the same way that the Russian government claims that it didn't shoot down flight MH17 over Ukraine, even though an abundance of evidence, including satellite imagery, shows to the contrary. So does this tip the scales in some way, or is it, or do you think that it actually forces governments to reckon with their actions in a really novel new way that wasn't true previously, or is it kind of just one more bit of evidence that piles up?
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting question. And I think it's a question that the community is, to my knowledge, is still very much trying to answer. I think one of the most interesting examples of this is Bellingcat's investigation in Libya, of people that were executed under a commander called Al-Warfali, who committed he basically committed a lot of grave human rights abuses, and among these were commanding his underlings to execute a bunch of people in a field, sort of at point blank range. And researchers from Bellingcat and sort of just other volunteer researchers that they worked with were able to do this largely using satellite images, in which were so good that they were able to detect the shadows of the body on the ground and even the blood stains that happened after that were there after the execution. So of course there are lots of projects like this, but what's remarkable about this one is that it was actually taken up by the ICC. And now it's sort of this question of to what extent can evidence gathered in this manner be used in international justice processes? And I think that that's something that courts in different parts of the world will have to sort of start to answer that question, sort of what is the threshold for the validity of this evidence? I tend to think of it much more from a journalistic perspective. I think as journalists, no matter what means we use to do an investigation, we're often hoping for an impact. And this is sort of no exception to that. Obviously, many of the tech source, at least some of the techniques that we use, can't be called open source techniques, or rather traditional methods, interviewing and looking at documentation. I think we sought to kind of build a stronger story by kind of marrying those traditional techniques with satellite images. And I think from the impact side, if you're a policymaker, that looks a lot stronger, because you're not saying, okay, let me rely on the evidence that we can see in the satellite image alone in order to make a policy decision. It's a lot easier if you see okay, this is a person who's actually been to this camp and can actually verify that this is indeed what we're looking at. And I think that sort of building up evidence in different layers for us has been a way to kind of close the credibility gap. A lot of people may not be familiar with satellite imagery analysis as kind of a journalistic method. So when you add kind of traditional methods on top of that, it makes it easier, I think, for the story to be taken seriously. And I guess anecdotally, we have heard a lot from policymakers in the US and in Europe that they're reading our work and that it's helped them make more informed decisions, which is exactly what we hoped for. I guess reporting on China it's a little bit different because you don't put out a critical story and then like the local government or whatever immediately responds to it and like sends you an email or makes some sort of change in response. And similarly, there's because of censorship in China, there's almost never like a kind of spontaneous well of public outrage that comes after investigations. So I think primarily we had hoped to have those impacts on policymakers outside of the country, and that is definitely part of what we've seen as the reaction to the series.
Thank you, Megha. I guess we're at the end of our time, and so I just wanted to end by asking you both what you're working on next, and what's next for you, and are there any fresh ways you hope to apply these tools, going down to different sorts of targets, different sorts of things? Alison, why don't we begin with you, and then Megha can follow.
Sure. So we're actually still working on Xinjiang, and we still see quite a lot of work to do in that field.
It's a big place, as you told us.
It's a big place, and there's a lot of bad things happening there. In one of our earlier investigations, we looked at the issue of forced labor within the camps, and we identified all of the factories within the camps, as well as a large number of companies which we believed were registered there. And so looking into those and the issue, and that issue of forced labor and supply chains is something that we plan to look at.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both for an excellent conversation, for sharing your reflections, and thank you so much for joining us today.